I think people need to see it because all the other journalists who were roped in need to see how they were described and need to see what was passed on to the National Cybersecurity Center.
I mean, this is, or it could be, or may well be, a deeply troubling attack on the work of the free press.
Oh, absolutely. It's outrageous. I mean, the one thing that makes it quasi-acceptable is that it was done, it was at least initiated before Keir Starmer came to power.
The government is abandoning the plan to delay elections for 30 local councils across the country. Reform UK had launched legal action over the delay, and ministers have now been warned that the move would be illegal. Elsewhere, Keir Starmer says the government's looking into the conduct of Labour Together. This is the left-wing think tank which paid for a dossier smearing Sunday Times journalists. The PR firm APCO compiled that report, which falsely claimed that the paper's reporting was based on a Russian hack. Terry Stiastny is our political correspondent today. Terry, it started off relatively quiet today, but as ever, the pace has picked up, hasn't it?
Yeah, recess or no recess.
Yeah, too right. So, I mean, there is no other way to interpret it, but the abandonment of the local council elections, which are now back on again, that's another U-turn.
It is another U-turn. If you look on the Housing and Local Government's website, on the 22nd of January, they were saying we are still going ahead with legislation to postpone elections for these councils, for 30 councils. That's going to affect more than 4.5 million people. And as of today, in the face of a High Court case which was being brought by Reform, they have decided to withdraw the decision and decided to go ahead with the local elections as they had been previously planned.
OK, now remind me why they were ever cancelled in the first place.
They were cancelled because in a lot of these, they were borough, district and some county councils in places like West and East Sussex, Norfolk, Suffolk, for instance. And they are where the local government is being reorganised. And the government, and to be fair, some of the councils had originally thought that this is too much to try and do, to be trying to reorganise your councils into unitary councils and then to be holding elections for, you know, the new body that's not really created yet. So the government said, well, look, we'll just put this off till next year. But they've been challenged.
Right. But the original problem still exists, but the elections will now go ahead.
The elections will now go ahead. The department said, following legal advice, the government's withdrawn its original decision to postpone 30 local elections in May. They say that providing certainty to the councils now is the most crucial thing. The government said it's going to have to change the legislation, revoke secondary legislation. It's written to the councils, it'll help them, and it's also promised them £63 million in new funding. So it's an expensive exercise.
A costly enterprise, as it's turned out.
And as we've seen, Nigel Farage's legal letter, in which he is very happy to have this letter from the government. He said we took the Labour government to court and won, and they'll also be paying his costs.
Right. So you have to say that's a triumph for Nigel Farage, isn't it?
Well, he's certainly, yeah. I mean, this was going to come to court on Thursday. Here we are on Monday, and the government's changed its decision. OK. First U-turn of the week, and it's not even 3:30 on a Monday.
Let's talk about the social media ban. I must admit, I was expecting something a little bit clearer out of all this today when the Prime Minister talked about it, but we now don't seem to have an imminent ban on social media access for the under-16s. I thought it was going to happen before the end of the year, but now I'm not so convinced.
No, the government's consultation is going on. It will go on for the next few months, and they are looking at whether there should be an outright social media ban for under-16s. But if you listen to what the Prime Minister was saying in public today when he's been meeting people and talking about it, he seems to say, look, there are still arguments on both sides, which is what his position has been up until now. He's saying, you know, yes, there is bad stuff, but there is also good stuff, for instance. And he was talking to some young people at a public event that he was doing, who were saying, well, I get my news through social media, for instance. Why would you want to stop me from doing that if you're going to let me vote when I'm 16?
Yes, but on the other hand, I mean, we're all haunted by images of young people in our lives endlessly gawping at their phones when really they could and should be doing something else. The government's got to do something about this at some point, surely.
Yes, I think they will do something at some point when this consultation is finished. One of the things that they want to crack down on more quickly that is not part of this consultation is things like AI chatbots, which get into very involved relationships with young people. They said that they could crack down on that, for instance, as they did when Grok on X started doing things involving images. They want to try and stop apps being set up to encourage you to doom scroll, to constantly be replaying things and sort of sucking you in more and more. So there are some things short of a full ban which they might well do more quickly than that.
Okay, and they really will have to do something quickly just to change the conversation, to make it look as though the government is indeed robust and proactive.
Well, yes, again, because, if the consultation comes back and they say, well, we've thought about this, but we're not going to do anything about it, then it starts to, yes, look like potentially another U-turn happening.
Stay with us, Terry, if you can. We're going to bring in Matt Taibbi. Now, he's one of the journalists who was researched about by the PR company APCO, because Labour Together had asked them to do that. It's not the best use of English I've ever employed, but let's go, or deployed, she says, battling for the right term, but let's carry on with it. Matt, hello, how are you? Where are you in the world?
I'm in New Jersey. Thank you for having me on.
Well, it's a pleasure. So tell us about this. You work for the Sunday Times, is that correct?
No, I don't. I have a site in the States called Racket on Substack. I worked for Rolling Stone for a long time.
Right.
But I'm in the middle of this mainly because I published some material by Paul Holden a few years ago. I also did some additional work of my own on Labor Together and its financial history here in the United States.
Okay, so pardon excuse my confusion.
That's all right.
But it's interesting that Labour Together are obviously part of your story. What were you reporting on Labour Together for?
So I had done a story that was gained a lot of attention in the States called the Twitter Files, that was largely about the suppression or censorship of political speech at various platforms like Twitter and Facebook. And I kept running into material involving something called the Center for Countering Digital Hate, which was tied to some folks in labor. Because of that reporting, Paul Holden, who had been doing research for quite some time, he's sort of British and South African. He ended up writing a book about Morgan McSweeney called Fraud and Labor Together. And he came to me with a lot of material that included unpublished emails and some other things that suggested financial corruption and some other things. And we published that. And as a result of that coverage, this dovetailed with another report that had come out in the Sunday Times. We were all kind of lumped together by Labor Together, and they hired this company to look at us.
Okay, so the suggestion that reporting on Labour Together was coming from Russian sources, what do you make of that?
So, first of all, it's completely absurd. We can demonstrate exactly where that material came from. Most of it, oddly enough, came from Freedom of Information requests. But the important part is that the reason you're hearing that is because we now know, looking at the materials that were involved in the commissioning of this contract, that one of the tasks that APCO had was to come up with an agreed upon narrative for countering the reporting of all these disparate journalists. You can imagine people like, Gabriel Pogren and myself and Paul Holden. None of us, at least I'm not, a colleague of most of those folks, but we were all lumped together as essentially useful idiots for Russia in this report. And the language, as I understand it, is more extreme than just saying that we used materials for from a Russian hack. So that's why you're hearing that story when a lot of the stuff is just source-based reporting.
And what do you want to happen right now then?
Well, the most immediate thing that I think needs to happen is that the public needs to see that final APCO report, because from my understanding, according to my sources, is that the thing that people are most concerned about in both within the Labor Party and at APCO is that that final report get out. The Sunday Times has it. I reported that over at the end of last week. They did a story about it on Saturday, but they have not released the contents of that report. And I think people need to see it because all the other journalists who were roped in need to see how they were described and need to see what was passed on to the National Cybersecurity Center.
I mean, this is, or it could be, or may well be, a deeply troubling attack on the work of the free press.
Oh, absolutely. It's outrageous. I mean, the one thing that makes it quasi acceptable is that it was at least initiated before Keir Starmer came to power. The problem is that this report was apparently circulated among members of the cabinet afterward, and nobody said anything about it. Nobody objected. And that is a serious problem when members of the government are using private intelligence firms, or at least using their product. And then also has been a lot of whispering to journalists about the contents of this report, and you will see that appearing in the news, uncredited and not attributed to any named sources, but it's out there, and that's a problem.
Thank you, Matt. That's Matt Taibbi. He was one of the journalists researched for that PR firm APCO's report. Terry, what do you think of that?
Well, I think, there's a slightly different situation in the United States. Obviously, Matt Taibbi was saying perhaps, we should publish all of the information that was gathered on people. And I think, probably many of the journalists named in that report would not necessarily want this information, much of it, which is probably not true, to be put into the public domain, even if it's not, in the interest of showing what was researched on them. The Cabinet Office is looking into this at the moment. We don't really know what the nature of that investigation is. Liz Kendall said earlier today they were looking into the facts of the issue, but one of the problems here is that one of the people they are looking into is a current junior minister in the Cabinet Office, Josh Simons, who worked for Labour Together before the election, and is now a minister. So, how do you investigate that when he is, one of the people potentially concerned with this? And although Downing Street saying, journalists should be able to report without fear or favour today, this is really potentially damaging that people who are now in government were getting a company to gather information on journalists. Now, they say the company concerned overstepped the mark and that wasn't what they were asked to do. But, this is something that we still need to find out more about.
Yeah, it's a pretty unusual set of circumstances, isn't it? At least I hope it's unusual.
I think it's unusual. I think it's certainly, rumours go around, gossip goes around, people spread stories about other people, but to sort of outsource to a PR company finding things out about people, claiming things about people and then putting them down in writing is I hope it's unusual.
Yes, well, exactly. We can agree on that.